Landlords, it's finally happening. The 2019 Conservative Party manifesto to create a fairer rental market for both landlords and tenants has finally passed the House of Commons. And the few changes that have been made along the process have really upset quite a few people. I was watching Channel 4 News the other day where I saw Ben Beetle from the Residential Landlord Association having some very strong opinions with Ben Twomey from the Renters Generation. And let me tell you, it's clear to see that neither of them are happy with the government.
You say it's a balanced bill, but that would mean that it had support from renters and landlords. It doesn't. You're from the landlords, and Ben, I just want to bring you in there to respond because you're representing the renters and you disagree.
Now, I'm going to share with you my perspective of the renters reform, and this is coming from someone who has to deal with both tenants and landlords, and also just my predictions of the rental market in the future. If you're a landlord or tenant, make sure you stay tuned. Now, you may already be aware about the renters reform bill, but what is it and what's the most important part of all of the proposals? Well, Section 21, also known as the no-fault eviction. We'll talk a little bit more about that as to what that means and why it's so important. But it's important also to have a look at what the other proposals in the bill are. Now, one of them, of course, is going to be the end of fixed term tenancies. So now tenancies are going to be running indefinitely. And the fact that this is the biggest rental reform that we've seen in a generation absolutely means you should hit that subscribe button so you can keep up to date with all things letting. A limit or restriction to rent increases to once per year. Pets, of course, you can't discriminate an applicant making application for tenancies that have pets. Tenant redress scheme requires all landlords to register with a new system for handling disputes. National database of landlords establishes a registry for increased landlord transparency. Special provisions for students' housing adapts rules to accommodate the academic calendar for student rentals. And finally, and certainly not least, is the abolishment of Section 21, also known as the no-fault eviction, which Michael Gove promised would be abolished.
Will this practice have ended by the time of the next general election?
We will have outlawed it, and we will have put the money into the courts in order to ensure that they can enforce that.
Okay.
Now, why is this so important and why does it have so many people upset? Well, firstly, currently, there are two ways that you can actually evict a tenant. Number one is Section 8, which you need a specific reason. Second one is Section 21, which you need no reason whatsoever. Let me share with you a story I heard recently. So I had a landlord whereby he wasn't getting his rent, and it's not the first time the tenant has done this. That tenant has also been subletting as well as not complying with other aspects of the tenancy. However, he decided to serve Section 8 and take the tenant to court and evict the tenant because they're not paying rent. Although at the very last hour, the tenant decided to pay rent and actually comply. What did this mean? It means that the Section 8 was no longer valid and the landlord had to start from scratch again. Had the landlord served Section 21, which is no reason whatsoever, the process would have been more straightforward and he would not have to start the process all over again. So it's certainly a more simple way of evicting a tenant. Now, let's look at the other side. I had a tenant share with me a challenge that they had, and they had been evicted with Section 21. And the reason was no other than the tenant being very demanding. At least this was the tenant's perspective. So again, it has its pros and it has its cons. So I can see both sides, tenant and landlord. And if you're a landlord or a tenant, find this video helpful, make sure you hit that like button. It really helps me out in pushing more of these videos to people just like you. So the big question is Section 21 going to be abolished? And the answer is no, at least not for now. So there's been a few amendments, and that includes a comprehensive review of the courts before abolishing Section 21 no-fault evictions. New rules are preventing tenants from giving 2 months notice with the first 4 months of a tenancy, effectively setting a minimum 6-month tenancy period. A review of the licensing requirements and expansion of the mandatory possession ground to include all students' accommodations, not just HMOs. And the bill could potentially change as it moves through the Lords, which does tend to be more extensive than the Commons, and yet Even if there are any amendments proposed, it's unlikely, just because it doesn't seem that the opposition is blocking anything, and of course Conservatives do have the majority. That being said, you never know. Labour Party might just come in and want to change absolutely everything and make things very challenging. Anyway, right now we are seeing the biggest reform that we've seen since the 1980s, 1990s, and it'll be interesting to see how this continues to play out. Now, if you are interested in finding out as to why landlords are really exiting the market, make sure you watch my other video. So I'm back in the office, but ultimately the government's intervention always has unintended consequences for tenants, especially when they're looking to protect tenants. I mean, an example of this, of course, is the 2019 tenant fee ban, but also the most recent rental cap up in Scotland. Both ended up in rental increasing through the roof. And of course, tenants are worse off now than what they were before. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm all for taking that professionalism standard to another level for both landlords and agents. But we've got to stop blaming landlords for the housing issues. There is a housing shortage in the UK, and it's been that way for years. That's really the debate that we should be having, including social housing. So let's not allow the government to continue to ignore this critical issue, and let's have those conversations. That's my take on this.